You fools!
What's up, gamers? How we doing? Today we're about to explore a list of top 50 most brutal arcade beat-em-ups. Now, I love beat-em-ups because they're honest. You walk into a level, punch a lot of trash, and the game rewards you with more punchable trash and a satisfying boss beatdown. So, for this video, I wanted to find the arcade brawlers that didn't bother pretending violence was cute. I'm calling this collection the Ultimate Violence Collection. Not to glorify blood for blood's sake, but because these games used horror, body horror, or sheer scale of carnage to make their combat memorable. You'll get classics that shaped the genre, and some oddball spin-offs that went full-on splatter. So without further ado, let's get right into it. Night Slashers, 1993. I'll start with one of my favorite hidden stars of the early 90s, Night Slashers, Data East's 1993 arcade horror brawler. On the surface, it's a classic belt-scrolling beat-em-up, left to right, waves of enemies, and a boss at the end of each stage. But Data East wrapped the whole thing in a pulpy horror movie aesthetic. You pick from 3 archetypal monster hunters, a cop, a ninja-style character, and a muscle-bound vampire hunter, and proceed through graveyards, haunted mansions, and the kind of set pieces you'd expect from a late-night horror marathon. What I like about Night Slashers is how committed it is to atmosphere without overcomplicating the combat. It keeps punch, kick, throw basics straightforward, but still gives you satisfying special moves and screen-clearing attacks that feel appropriately cinematic. The sound design is full of crunches and growls. On the downside, the moveset can feel a little limited compared to later beat-em-ups that layered combos and juggling. Some modern players find it a touch repetitive if they're used to combo-heavy action. That said, fans of horror brawlers praise Night Slashers, and the game's cult status led to a modern remake effort that was released in 2024, which shows how much nostalgia and demand still surround this one. Splatterhouse, 1988. If you want a game that wore weird and violent like a badge, Splatterhouse is it. Namco's 1988 arcade Splatterhouse takes its cues from American haunted house and slasher tropes. The premise is gloriously simple. You are Rick, or the game's monstrous avatar. You're trying to rescue Jennifer, and the mansion is irredeemably cursed. So you throw fists, smash things, and keep moving. The arcade version set the tone, and the series later migrated to home consoles. Most famously, the TurboGrafx 16 or PC Engine ports. For the TurboGrafx 16, Release the Box even sported a parody parental advisory warning, a wink at its own over-the-top gore-first persona. From my point of view, Splatterhouse's charm is its commitment to the schlock horror vibe. The enemy designs and sound effects are purposefully lurid, and the game doesn't bother dressing its horror up in realism. That gives it a campy energy that many players find irresistible. On the flip side, modern players sometimes note the controls can be stiff, hit detection isn't always crisp by current standards, and some of the home ports trimmed content or changed difficulty. Still, Splatterhouse spawned sequels and a 2010 modern remake, and the arcade original remains a historically important horror brawler mashup. Battletoads Arcade, 1994. I know what you're thinking. Battletoads, the snackable, meme-prone NES challenge? The arcade sibling, released by Rare in 1994 and published by Electronic Arts, takes that irreverent franchise and turns up the grit. Battletoads Arcade sometimes called Super Battletoads, was built for coin-op audiences with larger sprites, more enemies, and, yes, blood and limb-severing effects that could be toggled via cabinet DIP switches. Rare used their early 3D tooling experience around this time and applied it to make visuals that popped in arcades. The result was both striking and a little unhinged compared to console entries. What I enjoy about the arcade Battletoads is its willingness to be more adult in tone. It's the same franchise DNA, but with a few more teeth. Gameplay-wise, it offers robust multiplayer, big-screen chaos, and a few set-piece moments that genuinely surprised me when I first saw them. But it's worth noting, this version didn't translate to a wide home release at the time. Several ports were canceled, and the game stayed an arcade oddity until Rare included an emulated copy in Rare Replay for Xbox One many years later. Because of its limited exposure, it's a cult pick.
Grab the rope!
Linda!
まだ終わっていない。
Zombie Revenge, 1999. I'll always give props to games that try to push a franchise into a different subgenre. That's exactly what Zombie Revenge does for the House of the Dead universe. Released by Sega in arcades and later ported to the Dreamcast in 1999, Zombie Revenge trades the light gun precision of the parent series for brutal up-close brawling. You play as one of a small team of agents, each with their own flavor of combo and weapon, and wade through a city full of zombies, mutants, and set pieces that feel like the darker cousin of a Saturday afternoon action film. The game is essentially a beat-em-up with occasional ranged mechanics and an emphasis on chaining attacks and using found weapons to keep the action fresh. I like Zombie Revenge because it blends frantic melee with the grotesque enemy design. The Naomi Arcade hardware gave it a distinct look, and the Dreamcast port lets you feel the impact of wallops and weapon swings in your controller. Critics and players often praised it for its atmosphere and boss encounters, but the reception was mixed when it came to depth. Some reviewers wanted more complex combo systems, and others felt the AI could be repetitive in later stages.
All right. I got it.
Alien vs. Predator, 1994. Capcom's 1994 Alien vs. Predator arcade brawler is nearly impossible to talk about without grinning. It's an age when Capcom's CPS2 hardware practically flexed on the cabinet, and every alley on screen could become a slaughterhouse for xenomorphs. The game pits humans and predators against hordes of xenomorphs and rogue soldiers in a tight, frantic beat-em-up that's cinematic in pace and ruthless in crowd density. You can play as two humans, including a version of Dutch Schaefer, or as two predators, and each choice meaningfully changes how you approach a stage. Predators are more acrobatic and bring different weapons, while humans feel more like grounded soldiers with firearms and melee options. I love AWP for how it balances spectacle with mechanical clarity. The stage design moves between urban ruins and alien nests, and Capcom filled both with ambushes, hazards, and huge cinematic bosses. Critics back then lauded it for graphics and sheer arcade presence, and it still shows up in retrospective lists of the best beat-em-ups. A frustrating note for some fans, the game never got a faithful official home conversion at the time. Console AVP games exist, but are different, so playing the original has traditionally meant hunting arcade boards or emulation. The Punisher, 1993. Capcom was in their absolute prime in the early 90s when it came to beat-em-ups, and The Punisher is one of those titles where you can feel that polish. Released in 1993 on their CPS-1 hardware, This arcade game let you pick between Frank Castle himself or Nick Fury, and yes, this was the old-school eye patch Fury. Right from the start, the game screams comic book mayhem. You're cleaning up the streets, tearing through gangs, and eventually facing off against the Kingpin himself. What makes the Punisher stand out for me is how seamlessly it blends melee and ranged combat. You've got your fists and kicks, but at any moment you can pull out a handgun and just start blasting. It creates this fast-paced rhythm. The downside, like a lot of coin-op games from that era, it's designed to eat quarters, and unless you're playing with a buddy, you'll probably run out of continues fast. But fans still hold this one up as one of the best comic-to-arcade adaptations. In fact, it's often mentioned in the same breath as X-Men and the aforementioned Alien vs. Predator. Sadly, licensing issues mean it never really got an official re-release, which makes it one of those if you know classics. Undercover Cops, 1992. Now this one is a weird gem. Irem, the company best known for R-Type, decided in 1992 to take a stab at the beat-em-up genre with Undercover Cops. And man, they went wild with it. The story is set in a grim, post-apocalyptic future where everything is rust, garbage, and grime. You pick from a trio of law enforcers, and instead of the polished comic book feel of Capcom, Undercover Cops throws you into dirty, crumbling cityscapes full of mutants and criminals that look like they crawled out of a toxic dump. What makes Undercover Cops memorable for me is its flavor. Everything is gritty, but not in the dull, gray-brown way of later 2000 games. Here, it's over-the-top, cartoony grit. Mechanically, it's not the tightest beat-em-up ever made. The collision detection sometimes feels a little floaty, and the character movement isn't as crisp as, say, Final Fight, but fans of arcade oddities adore it for its style and imagination. It's one of those games where half the fun is just seeing what weird enemy or bizarre background detail shows up next. And like Night Slashers, this one eventually got a re-release decades later. Vendetta Crime Fighters 2, 1991. Konami was no stranger to beat-em-ups, and Vendetta, the sequel to Crime Fighters, is one of their most gloriously trashy contributions to the genre. Released in 1991, Vendetta is straight-up gang warfare. You and your crew roll into the city, and your mission is to rescue your kidnapped friend from a rival gang. What I love about Vendetta is how raw it feels compared to some of Konami's more polished, family-friendly titles. This game was not shy about being violent or sleazy. In fact, the Japanese version even had a notorious gang of leather-clad enemies with very, let's just say, suggestive animations, which were censored or changed in other regions. Only in the 90s would something like that even make it into a mainstream arcade release. Gameplay-wise, it takes the Final Fight formula and makes it faster and a little nastier. Throws feel impactful, weapons are plentiful, and the enemy variety is high enough that you don't get bored in the first stage. The downside is that it can get cheap in later levels. You know the drill. Screen full of enemies, your health bar evaporates. But for arcade audiences in the early 90s, Vendetta was the perfect mix of brutal action and ridiculous character design.
Metamorphic Force.
Metamorphic Force, 1993. Now we're back with Konami again, this time in 1993, and Metamorphic Force is their attempt to combine beat-em-ups with shape-shifting superhero fantasy. Picture this. You pick a human fighter, but with the push of a button, you can transform into a giant anthropomorphic beast, like a werewolf, a minotaur, or a panther man, and just demolish enemies. The premise is pure Saturday morning cartoon nonsense. Evil threatens the world, and only the Guardians, aka your beast warriors, can save it. But the execution is what makes it stand out. The transformations feel impactful. Your moves change, your reach expands, and suddenly, you're a walking wall of destruction. The sprites are large and detailed, with Konami's usual knack for color and animation. I remember the bosses being especially impressive, towering over your character and filling the screen with attacks. The criticism? It didn't innovate much beyond the transformation gimmick. Strip away the animal forms, and you've got a fairly standard Final Fight style brawler. But honestly, the beast mechanic adds just enough spice that it sticks in people's memories. Guardians of the Hood, 1992. Okay, I have to admit, this one's a bit of a guilty pleasure. Atari's Guardians of the Hood came out in 1992, and while it tried really hard to ride the beat-em-up wave, it ended up being remembered mostly for how awkward and unintentionally funny it looks. The big gimmick here was that it used digitized actors like Mortal Kombat for its characters, which at the time sounded futuristic. In practice, though, it looked kinda clunky, like a low-budget action flick playing on a loop. The premise is simple. You're cleaning up the streets with your gang of vigilantes, taking down rival gangs and bosses. The arenas are urban backdrops, full of graffiti and neon. The problem is that the digitized visuals didn't animate smoothly, so punches and kicks often looked like someone's uncle trying to breakdance at a wedding. Combine that with sound effects that don't always match the action, and you've got a game that's as hilarious as it is violent. That said, Guardians of the Hood is still brutally entertaining in its own way. And in a list like this, celebrating brutal, gory, and bizarre arcade brawlers, it absolutely earns its spot. Crime Fighters, 1989. Konami's Crime Fighters is one of those games that looks like it was made by a group of developers who just watched The Warriors and Streets of Fire on VHS back-to-back. Released in 1989, it's essentially Konami's dry run before Vendetta and other brawlers that really hit their stride. You play as a group of vigilantes taking down street gangs, rescuing kidnapped women, and punching your way through alleys, subways, and biker hangouts. What makes Crime Fighters stand out, and also infamous, is how brutal it was in both gameplay and design. This thing is hard. It doesn't just expect you to pump quarters in, it downright bullies you into it. Your health constantly ticks down like a timer, which means you're paying for every second you're alive, even if enemies aren't hitting you. On the plus side, it has that gritty Konami art style we all love, complete with graffiti backgrounds and big, meaty enemy sprites. If you want to experience what arcade designers thought was fair in 1989, Crime Fighters is a perfect time capsule. The Combatribes, 1990. Techno's Japan, the house that gave us Double Dragon and Kunio-kun. In 1990, they unleashed the Combatribes, which feels like Double Dragon's buff, steroid-injected cousin. The setup is classic. Futuristic New York is overrun by gangs, and your trio of cyber-enhanced fighters has to clean things up. This one is pure chaos. You're not just punching dudes, you're swinging them around like rag dolls, pile-driving them, or just repeatedly bashing their heads into the pavement. The violence is exaggerated to the point of being cartoonish, but that's exactly why it's fun. The bosses are outrageous too. Mechanically, it's a little stiff. Movement is slower compared to Konami or Capcom brawlers, and the collision can feel clunky, but the over-the-top violence and character designs make it unforgettable. Cadillacs and Dinosaurs, 1993. If there's a Hall of Fame for arcade beat-em-ups, Cadillacs and Dinosaurs has a front row seat. Capcom dropped this beauty in 1993, based on the Xenozoic Tales comic, And the premise? Humans driving Cadillacs and fighting dinosaurs in a post-apocalyptic wasteland. You don't need to sell me harder than that. The gameplay is peak Capcom. Smooth controls, satisfying combos, weapons everywhere, and 4-player co-op that makes the chaos even better. What makes this game stand out is how it combines two totally different vibes, gang warfare and prehistoric mayhem. One moment you're punching bikers in the face, the next a T-Rex crashes the party and forces everyone to stop fighting humans and deal with the dinosaur threat. The violence here isn't just cartoony, it's stylish. Fans still rave about the boss fights, the variety of environments, and how the game never overstays its welcome. It's widely regarded as one of Capcom's best, and honestly, it's still a blast to play 30 years later. Violent Storm, 1993. Konami clearly saw what Capcom was doing and said, "Hold my beer." Violent Storm, released in 1993, is their flashy attempt to keep pace with Final Fight and Cadillacs and Dinosaurs. This game is loud, colorful, and ridiculous. The plot? It's post-apocalyptic again. Shocker. And you're 3 tough guys fighting to rescue a kidnapped girl from a street gang called Geld. The graphics are almost too much. Bright neon, wild enemy animations, and backgrounds that feel alive. Imagine a Saturday morning cartoon got slammed into a Mad Max script, and that's the vibe. The combat is very Konami. Fast, chunky, and fun. There's even a surprising amount of slapstick. You can kick enemies into toilets or watch them flail around comically before going down. Players who grew up with it in arcades remember it fondly as a hidden gem that got overshadowed by Capcom's juggernauts. Zero Team, 1993. Seibu Kaihatsu. Best known for their shooters, Raiden anyone? They dipped their toes into the beat-em-up world with Zero Team in 1993, and honestly, they did a solid job. You pick one of 4 heroes and punch your way through a very Final Fight-inspired city. The graphics are crisp, the characters have personality, and it has that clean, early 90s arcade look. The combat is straightforward, punches, kicks, throws, but it feels polished. One nice touch. Co-op play is especially smooth, making this a good choice for 2 or more players just wanting to brawl without too much fuss. Where it falls short is originality. It doesn't have the wacky enemies of Undercover Cops or the spectacle of Cadillacs and Dinosaurs. It's more like, here's a competent beat 'em up, have fun. And honestly, sometimes that's enough. For arcade goers back in the day, Zero Team was reliable. It's not a legend, but it's definitely not forgotten either. Denjen Makai, 1994. Now here's a brawler that doesn't get talked about nearly enough. Denjen Makai, developed by Winkysoft in 1994, feels like it was made for people who thought Final Fight was too basic. Instead of just a couple of punches and a throw, this one gives you a surprisingly deep moveset. Multiple attacks, aerial combos, dash moves, and even tag team mechanics if you're playing co-op. It's like they took the fighting game complexity of the early 90s and shoved it into a side-scrolling beat-em-up. The roster is big too, 6 unique characters, each with their own special moves, fighting styles, and flashy finishers. The presentation screams mid-1990s anime, colorful, exaggerated, and just stylish enough that it sticks in your head. The downside is, it never had the same reach as Capcom's offerings, so outside of Japan, it's always been kind of obscure, but among fans of deep, mechanically rich beat-em-ups, Denjen Makai is a cult classic. If you're bored of button mashers and want something with actual combat depth, this one's worth tracking down. Guardians, Denjen Makai 2, 1995. If Denjen Makai was a hidden gem, Guardians, its 1995 sequel, was Winkysoft saying, "Okay, now we're showing off." They kept the same core system, but expanded everything. More playable characters, 8 this time, tighter combat, more fluid animation, and some genuinely awesome co-op mechanics. Guardians is the game where you and your buddy can start pulling off team throws and air juggles that feel way ahead of their time. The graphics are peak mid-1990s arcade. Big, bold sprites with tons of personality. Stages are colorful and varied, with cyberpunk vibes, ruined cities, and strange industrial layers. The bosses are massive screen-filling beasts that test your reflexes. What I personally love is that Guardians feels like it anticipated what beat-em-ups could be. Not just simple quarter munchers, but stylish, skill-based fighters with replay value. Unfortunately, much like its predecessor, it never got the same mainstream attention as Capcom or Sega titles. Outside of emulation and fan communities, a lot of gamers still haven't touched it. But if you ask hardcore arcade heads, this is often ranked as one of the best and most brutal beat-em-ups of its time. Gaia Crusaders, 1999. By the late 90s, beat-em-ups were already dying out in arcades, but Noise Factory, the same studio behind Metal Slug 3 later on, dropped Gaia Crusaders in 1999 as a kind of last hurrah. And man, it's a wild one. The game blends traditional brawling with elemental powers, so you're not just punching people, you're summoning fire, lightning, and earthquakes mid-combo. The style is very SNK-inspired sharp pixel art, fast animations, and over-the-top special moves. Honestly, it feels like someone mashed a King of Fighters game into a beat-em-up. The character roster is pretty diverse too, including a monk, a martial artist, and a hulking wrestler type. What makes it brutal is the sheer amount of screen-clearing chaos. You're constantly unleashing massive attacks that melt entire groups of enemies, which keeps the pacing high and the difficulty punishing. The downside? It came out so late in the arcade cycle that hardly anyone saw it, and it was never ported to consoles. Still, fans who have played it via emulation call it a hidden gem. Shadow Force, 1993. This one's obscure, but it deserves a spotlight. Shadow Force, developed by Technos in 1993, tried to push the genre forward with a unique possession mechanic. Instead of just beating enemies down, you could literally take control of them mid-fight and use their abilities. Imagine grabbing a boss and suddenly piloting their moveset against their own gang. That's next-level creativity for the time. Visually, it's very much in that gritty, early 90s mold. Dark cityscapes, mutated thugs, and big, beefy sprites. But the possession system is what sets it apart from dozens of other belt-scrollers. It gives the game a different rhythm. You're not just surviving waves, you're experimenting with who you can body snatch next. On the downside, the controls weren't as polished as Capcom or Konami titles. Sometimes grabbing and switching bodies feels clunky, and the difficulty spikes are downright cruel. But hardcore fans still praise Shadow Force for being ambitious, even if it wasn't perfect. Warrior Blade, Rastin Saga, Episode 3, 1991. Taito's Warrior Blade, 1991, is a fascinating entry because it's both a sequel and a complete departure. The original Rastin was a Conan-style hack-and-slash platformer, but this third entry turned it into a full-on side-scrolling beat-em-up. And honestly, it works. You get 3 playable characters: Rastin himself, a barbarian woman, and a centaur warrior. Yes, a playable centaur. That alone is worth the price of admission. The game also had an unusual widescreen dual-monitor setup in arcades, giving you a huge playfield that made it feel more cinematic than most brawlers of the time. Combat is straightforward hack and slash with swords, axes, and lots of monster blood. The bosses are giant beasts pulled straight out of pulp fantasy: dragons, ogres, and demons. It's brutal in that heavy metal album cover kind of way. The controls can feel a little stiff compared to later games, but Warrior Blade deserves credit for being experimental and visually striking. Not many arcades were brave enough to set up dual monitors, but if you found one, it was an unforgettable sight. Captain Commando, 1991. If you grew up in arcades, you've either played Captain Commando or at least heard someone rave about it. Released by Capcom in 1991, this game is basically Final Fight's flashier younger sibling. You've got 4-player co-op, a futuristic setting, and a cast of absolutely ridiculous characters. Captain Commando himself, a superhero in a skin-tight suit, Mac the Knife, an alien mummy with knives for weapons, Ginzu the Ninja, self-explanatory, and Babyhead, a literal baby piloting a mech suit. Yes, a baby in a mech. Peak Capcom weirdness. The combat is smooth, crunchy, and fun, with plenty of weapons to spice things up. What I've always loved is how much personality oozes out of the characters and enemies. The futuristic city stages feel alive, and the bosses are memorable. Sure, it's a little coin-hungry in later stages, and the balance between characters isn't perfect, but that doesn't stop Captain Commando from being a fan favorite. It's one of those games that proved Capcom could take the Final Fight formula and keep reinventing it with style. The Ninja Warriors, 1987. Now, let's rewind to 1987 with Tato's The Ninja Warriors. This game predates a lot of the belt-scroller craze and has one of the coolest gimmicks of the era. A triple-wide monitor setup that stretched across the arcade cabinet. Imagine walking into an arcade and seeing a ninja brawler spread across 3 screens. That's how you grabbed attention. The game itself is a side-scrolling action beat-em-up where you control robot ninjas mowing down waves of enemies in a dystopian future. It's a little slower than later beat-em-ups, more deliberate, almost like Shinobi meets Kung Fu Master, but the atmosphere is fantastic. Moody music, dark cityscapes, and that giant display made it cinematic in a way few games were in the late 80s. It's definitely more primitive compared to 90s titles, but it deserves respect for pioneering spectacle in arcade hardware. Later, Taito even remade and updated it, the Ninja Warriors again on SNES, and the Ninja Saviors decades later. This one's a foundational piece of brawler history. Knights of Valor, 1999. If you're into Dynasty Warriors or romance of the Three Kingdoms lore, you'll want to know about IGS's Knights of Valor. Released in 1999, this Taiwanese beat-em-up takes the Chinese historical setting and mashes it into the side-scrolling brawler template. What's cool is that it has RPG elements layered on top, experience points, branching paths, hidden items, and multiple playable characters, each drawn from Chinese folklore and history. You're not just button mashing, you're grinding, leveling up, and collecting loot like you would in an RPG. Visually, it's gorgeous for the time. Richly detailed sprites, traditional Chinese backdrops, and flashy special moves that light up the screen. The violence is there, but it's more stylized. Heroic warriors clashing in massive battles rather than straight gore. Fans in Asia loved it, and it spawned multiple sequels, spin-offs, and even modern remasters. For Western players, though, it remained a bit of an underground title since it didn't see the same distribution as Capcom or Konami games. Still, it's proof the genre could go global and borrow from different cultural myths to stay fresh. Knights of the Round, 1991, Capcom again, and this time they're dipping into Arthurian legend. Knights of the Round, 1991, is their medieval take on the Final Fight formula. You play as Arthur, Lancelot, or Percival, slashing your way through hordes of bandits, knights, and mythological beasts. The game has a cool progression system where your armor literally upgrades as you go along. The more points you rack up, the fancier your knight becomes. A nice visual reward that makes you feel more powerful. Combat focuses on swordplay, with wide sweeping attacks that give it a different rhythm compared to punch-heavy games. I love the mounted combat sections too. Getting on horseback and cleaving through enemies feels epic in a way that few arcade brawlers managed. The only gripe? It's a bit repetitive after a while, and some players felt the hit detection was slightly clunky, but it's still a fan favorite, especially for anyone who grew up obsessed with knights and castles. For Capcom, it was another example of their ability to take a simple genre and reskin it with style. Warriors of Fate Tenchi wo Kurao 2, 1992. Next up is Warriors of Fate, Capcom 1992, also known as Tenchi wo Kurao 2 in Japan. This one's another Three Kingdoms inspired beat-em-up, but with Capcom's flair for large sprites and frantic action. You pick from 5 warriors, each based on legendary Chinese figures, and smash your way through battlefields full of soldiers, generals, and bosses straight out of the history books. It has that epic, sweeping vibe, massive crowds, colorful stage transitions, and giant bosses that feel like entire armies unto themselves. The combat feels closer to Final Fight than Knights of the Round, with a lot of throws, grapples, and big special attacks. It also features mounted combat, which adds variety and makes it feel like a true battlefield brawler. Players who found it in arcades remember how overwhelming it could get. The screen absolutely floods with enemies, but that was part of the appeal. If you wanted a beat 'em up that felt like a war movie, this was the one to play. Robo Army, 1991. SNK had this wild streak in the early 90s, and Robo Army is the perfect example. The premise is straight B-movie. Evil robots are taking over, and it's up to 2 cyborg heroes to smash through the mechanical hordes. I've always found Robo Army charming because of how ridiculous it is. You're not just punching and kicking, you're ripping car doors off the street and using them as shields or weapons. Sometimes, you literally transform into a car yourself, just plowing enemies down. It's goofy, over the top, and very SNK. The graphics are bright and bold, with chunky robot designs that feel somewhere between scary and silly. The music has that crunchy SNK arcade vibe, heavy on synths and energy. Technically, it plays well. Big hitboxes, satisfying enemy explosions, and a decent variety of moves. The downside? It can feel repetitive. Enemy variety isn't huge, and some stages drag. Also, the difficulty curve spikes hard, especially if you're solo. Still, I think the charm outweighs the flaws. It's not as polished as Capcom's beat-em-ups, but it's got personality. POW, Prisoners of War, 1988. Now this one is pure late 80s arcade grit. In POW, you play as a captured soldier who busts out of prison and fights his way through guards, bikers, helicopters, and tanks to escape. The setup feels like something ripped straight out of an 80s action flick starring Stallone or Chuck Norris. I remember the first time I played this and realized how simple yet addictive it was. Punch, kick, grab a weapon, repeat. It doesn't reinvent the wheel, but it nails that one more quarter feel. Weapons add some spice, knives, rifles, grenades, and the game lets you punch enemies off motorcycles, which is always satisfying. The graphics are serviceable for 88, not mind-blowing, but gritty enough to sell the prison break vibe. Music is forgettable, but the sound effects, especially the crunch of a punch landing, are solid. The bad? Enemy AI can feel cheap. Enemies swarm from both sides constantly, forcing you into frustrating traps. It's also a quarter muncher, no doubt about it. Bosses soak damage like sponges, and some attacks feel unfair. Still, POW has that raw appeal. You're not a superhero, you're just a desperate soldier trying to claw your way out, and that makes every punch feel earned. Final Fight 1989. This is the game, the gold standard, the one everyone compares the rest to. Capcom's Final Fight isn't just a beat-em-up, it's a landmark in arcade history. The premise is simple but iconic. Mad Gear Gang kidnaps the mayor's daughter, and instead of calling the cops, Mayor Hager grabs suspenders, flexes, and literally pile drives his way through the city. Playing Final Fight still feels fantastic. Hager, Cody, and Guy each bring their own style, raw power, balanced fists, and ninja speed. The moves are simple but satisfying, and enemies have just enough variety to keep you on your toes. The big sprites were revolutionary at the time, chunky, expressive, and colorful. On the technical side, the pacing is masterful. Stages escalate just right, throwing new challenges without overwhelming you too early. The music? Pure arcade energy. Hager's stage themes live rent-free in my head. Of course, it has flaws. The original arcade only allowed 2 players, not 3, which feels like a missed opportunity. Enemies sometimes stun-lock you unfairly, and later levels are brutal quarter vacuums. But despite the flaws, Final Fight is timeless. It's not just a game, it's an experience. 2 Crude, Crude Buster, 1991. Data East had no shame in going full weird, and 2 Crude is a perfect example. The premise is that in a post-apocalyptic future, mutant gangs have taken over New York, and only 2 over-muscled mercenaries can save the day. It's basically Mad Max with neon steroids. The first thing that stands out is how ridiculous it is. Your characters are these hulking cartoon beefcakes who can literally pick up cars, street signs, and even enemies to throw as weapons. It's absurd, it's loud, and it's pure arcade chaos. I've always appreciated the humor in 2 Crude. Enemies look goofy, animations are exaggerated, and everything feels like it's winking at you. The graphics pop with colorful sprites, and the sound design leans hard into crunchy hits. But here's the rub. The controls are clunky, movement feels stiff, hit detection can be frustrating, and bosses are pure quarter munchers. It's not as smooth as Capcom's offerings, and that holds it back. But there's something cathartic about lifting an entire car and smashing mutants with it. It's dumb fun, and sometimes that's enough. Burning Fight, 1991. In SNK's Burning Fight, a crime syndicate is terrorizing Osaka, and 3 fighters, a cop, a brawler, and a ninja, take to the streets to clean it up. Pretty boilerplate stuff, but it gets the job done. What I like about Burning Fight is the setting. Instead of another generic city, you're fighting through Japanese arcades, shops, and subway stations. There's even a level in a pachinko parlor very meta for an arcade game. The environments feel alive and grounded in real Japan, which makes it stand out. Gameplay-wise, it's fine but not stellar. Moves are responsive, weapons are fun, nunchucks, knives, even guns, and enemies come at you in waves. But it lacks the polish of Capcom's work. Combos don't flow as smoothly, and animations feel a bit stiff. The difficulty curve is also frustrating. Enemies gang up on you unfairly, and boss fights can be repetitive. Still, I admire SNK's ambition. They didn't just copy the formula, they gave it their own cultural spin. Is it essential? Not really, but it's an interesting curiosity in SNK's library, especially if you want to see their take on the genre before King of Fighters and Metal Slug cemented their legacy. Sangoku, 1991. SNK's Sangoku drops you into a cursed modern city where ancient samurai spirits and demons invade. The premise alone sets it apart. It's not gangsters or mutants, but feudal Japan colliding with the present day. Mechanically, it's a little janky, but ambitious. You don't just fight as your main character, you can transform into spirit warriors. A wolf, a ninja, even a samurai ghost. It's a cool idea, letting you swap playstyles mid-fight. The graphics are very SNK, bold, colorful, but rough around the edges. Enemy designs are surreal floating monks, possessed samurai, and other demonic figures. The music leans into eerie Japanese instrumentation, giving it a haunting vibe. The bad? Controls aren't tight, hit detection feels off, animations are stiff, and the difficulty spikes hard. Sometimes it feels like style over substance, but I can't deny it has charm. I think of Sangoku as an experimental beat-em-up, rough, strange, but daring. Later sequels refined it, but the first game still deserves credit for trying something so different. Ninja Gaiden or Shadow Warriors Arcade, 1988. Most people think of Ninja Gaiden as the punishing NES platformer, but the arcade version was a completely different beast, a side-scrolling beat-em-up. You play as a ninja battling thugs, demons, and supernatural creatures across US cityscapes. The game is brutal, controls are responsive enough, but enemies swarm constantly, and the difficulty ramps up fast. You've got a basic punch, kick, jump kick, and the occasional sword or power-up. One cool gimmick? Environmental kills, you can slam enemies into signposts or trash cans in the background. It adds a nice cinematic flair. Graphically, it's solid for 88. Big sprites, detailed backgrounds, and an edgy tone that set it apart from more cartoony brawlers. The soundtrack is pounding, almost aggressive, fitting the relentless pace. But man, is it hard. Cheap shots, endless enemies, and bosses that feel unfair make it a wallet drainer. It also lacks the depth of later beat-em-ups. Once you've seen a couple of stages, you've seen most of what it offers. That said, it has a raw energy I love. It feels like a prototype for later, more polished arcade brawlers. Not perfect, but historically fascinating. Legionnaire, 1992. Legionnaire by TAD Corporation, yes, the guys behind Cabal, is one of those games you probably never saw in arcades. But if you did, it stuck with you. The premise is as classic as it gets. A city under siege and 4 fighters, a cop, a martial artist, a wrestler, and a femme fatale, rise up to clean house. The graphics are pretty striking. Characters are large, well animated, and distinct. Stages have variety city streets, bars, even rooftops, and the bosses are imposing. It's technically sound, with crisp controls and solid hit detection. Where it shines is in the movesets. Each character has unique combos and throws, giving the game more replay value than some of its contemporaries. I also love the detail. Enemies recoil differently depending on how you hit them, which adds weight to combat. The negatives? It's brutally hard. Enemies gang up relentlessly, and bosses spam cheap moves. It's also not as stylish or memorable as Capcom's offerings. Still, I respect Legionnaire. It's polished, challenging, and underrated. If you're into digging up forgotten gems, this is one worth revisiting. Armored Warriors, 1994. If there's one beat-em-up that screams mid-1990s Capcom excess, it's Armored Warriors. You're not Street Fighters here. You're piloting giant mechs in a futuristic war zone. The premise alone makes it stand out. The gameplay is wild. You can punch, kick, and slash, but the real hook is customization. As you fight, you rip weapons and parts off enemy mechs, rocket fists, drills, laser cannons, and attach them to your own. It's like a giant robot junkyard brawl where every fight changes your loadout. The graphics are gorgeous, massive sprites, destructible environments, and bosses that fill the screen. The soundtrack is energetic, with pounding arcade beats that keep the adrenaline high. On the downside, it's chaotic to the point of confusion, with all the explosions, mech parts, and enemy swarms. It's easy to lose track of your character. Balance is also an issue. Some weapons feel overpowered, while others are useless. And yes, it's another Capcom quarter muncher, but when it clicks, it's glorious. Few beat-em-ups feel this big. You're not just fighting thugs in alleys, you're waging a giant robot war. DD Crew, 1991. Sega's DD Crew is often called their answer to Final Fight, and honestly, that's exactly what it is. 4 playable characters, each a street brawler archetype, taking on gangs across the city. The plot? Stop the syndicate. Simple, but serviceable. What I like about DD Crew is its 4-player co-op. At the time, that was a big deal. The sprites are colorful, the moves are varied enough, and the soundtrack has that Sega arcade flair. Stages change things up nicely, from city streets to moving vehicles. But here's the catch. It feels slower and clunkier than Capcom's work. Movements are sluggish, and enemies take forever to go down. Animations lack the punchiness you'd expect, and that kills some of the fun. That said, with friends, DD Crew is a blast. 4 players smashing waves of enemies at once makes up for the mechanical shortcomings. Alone, though, it gets tedious. So yeah, it's not Sega's best effort, but it's an important piece of their arcade history. Die Hard Arcade, Dynamite Deca, 1996. Now this one's legendary. Sega's Die Hard Arcade, or Dynamite Deca. If you played it in Japan, is a wild ride that mashes together beat-em-up chaos with quick-time events and gunplay. Yes, Die Hard, but in arcade form. The setup is basically Bruce Willis storming a skyscraper to save the president's daughter from terrorists. It doesn't follow the movie exactly, but it nails the spirit. Non-stop mayhem, explosions everywhere, and ridiculous set pieces. What I love is the variety. You don't just brawl, you use chairs, brooms, even frying pans as weapons. Guns show up a lot too, and the game doesn't slow down. It keeps the chaos flowing. Technically, it was ahead of its time, running on Sega's Model 2 hardware. The 3D visuals were blocky but groundbreaking in 1996, and the way the game blended QTEs into the action felt fresh. On the downside, the difficulty is relentless. Enemies swarm hard, and the QTEs are unforgiving if you miss them. The story is campy nonsense, but in the best way possible. For me, Die Hard Arcade is one of those games where even the flaws make it more fun. It's clunky, explosive, and absolutely unforgettable. Dynamite Cop, Dynamite Deca 2, 1998. If Die Hard Arcade was wild, Dynamite Cop, or Dynamite Deca 2, just turned the dial to 11. This time, you're storming a cruise ship hijacked by modern-day pirates, and the plot is pure action movie cheese. Save the kidnapped president's daughter again, but this time on the high seas. The gameplay expands on the original, but makes everything crazier. The QTEs are still here, but smoother. The environments are more varied, ranging from casinos to cargo bays, each stuffed with absurd props you can weaponize. My favorite memory is grabbing giant tuna from the ship's kitchen and smacking enemies with them. Where else can you say you did that? Graphically, the game shines compared to its predecessor, thanks to Sega's Model 2 hardware pushing out brighter, more detailed 3D visuals. Characters animate fluidly, and bosses look larger than life. The game also introduces branching paths, which give it more replay value. But let's be honest, it's still brutally hard. Enemies swarm in relentless waves, bosses soak up punishment, and QTEs can kill the momentum if you mess them up. Some players also feel the story is just nonsense, but that's half the charm. Personally, I adore Dynamite Cop. It's the kind of beat-em-up that doesn't care about subtlety. It's loud, it's dumb, and it's packed with arcade personality. Golden Axe, The Revenge of Death Adder, 1992. Now, if you loved Golden Axe, this sequel is basically the arcade dream version, The Revenge of Death. Adder took everything the original did and dialed it up: bigger characters, flashier magic, and multiplayer mayhem for up to 4 people at once. The premise picks up where the first game left off. Death Adder, the giant armored villain, is back from the dead, and it's up to a new band of heroes to stop him. The cast is more diverse this time. You've got a centaur, a giant with a pitchfork, and even a barbarian woman alongside your standard warrior type. Each character feels distinct, with unique magic attacks and movesets. Visually, the game is stunning for 1992. The sprites are massive and detailed, the stages are colorful, and the animations make every axe swing feel powerful. Environments aren't just static backgrounds. You ride elevators, cross rickety bridges, and fight in castles that crumble around you. On the gameplay side, it's still side-scrolling brawling, but smoother and more dynamic than the original. Mounts make a return too. With dragons and scorpions you can ride into battle. The bad? It was never ported to home consoles properly, so for years it was arcade exclusive and rare to experience. And yes, the difficulty is unforgiving, especially in later stages. But for me, this game is peak Sega arcade magic. Dungeons and Dragons, Shadow over Mystara, 1996. Capcom really flexed their creative muscles with Dungeons and Dragons, Shadow over Mystara. Released in 1996, it wasn't just a beat-em-up, it was an RPG light arcade adventure. And honestly, it blew my mind the first time I saw it. The premise puts you in the classic D&D world of Mystara, with a party of adventurers, fighter, cleric, thief, elf, etc., journeying through forests, dungeons, and castles to defeat a rising evil. It's straight out of a tabletop campaign, and the game embraces that fully. What makes it shine is the depth. Unlike most arcade brawlers, you don't just mash attack. You cast spells, manage inventory, and even make choices that branch the story. Want to fight the Red Dragon boss or sneak past it? You decide. That kind of freedom was unheard of in arcades. Technically, it's gorgeous. Capcom's CPS2 hardware pumps out rich, detailed sprites and animations. The magic effects are jaw-dropping, with screen-filling fireballs and lightning storms. The soundtrack adds that high fantasy flair, pushing the immersion even further. Of course, the complexity can overwhelm newcomers. Managing spells mid-battle while enemies swarm isn't easy, and the quarter-munching difficulty is still there. But the blend of D&D mechanics with arcade combat is brilliant. Growl, Runark, 1990. Taito's Growl is one of those games that sticks in my head, not because it's amazing, but because it's so weirdly memorable. The premise is simple. You're part of a squad of adventurers trying to save endangered animals from poachers. Already, that's a more noble setup than most beat-em-ups. Instead of rescuing the mayor's daughter, you're punching guys to protect elephants, tigers, and pandas. I can respect that. Gameplay-wise, Growl is a 4-player beat-em-up, which was a huge deal in 1990. The fighting is straightforward punch, kick, jump, but the real highlight is the sheer amount of weapons. You can use whips, guns, swords, bazookas, even grenades. It's chaotic in the best way, with explosions and animals stampeding across the screen. But here's the thing, the game is janky. Enemy waves feel relentless, hit detection can be spotty, and some bosses soak up way too much punishment. The graphics, while colorful, look dated even for 1990. The music? Pretty generic. What saves it for me is the sheer camp value. Watching rescued animals turn on poachers and attack them is hilarious and kind of satisfying. I can't say Growl is a polished masterpiece, but I love its over-the-top chaos. Battle Circuit 1997. Battle Circuit is one of those late-era Capcom beat-em-ups that makes me wish arcades had stayed alive a little longer. Released in 1997, when 3D fighters were already dominating, it's colorful, quirky, and ridiculously creative. The premise? You play as a group of bounty hunters in a cyberpunk future, chasing down criminals while also preventing a world-threatening conspiracy. The character roster is pure Capcom weirdness. You've got Cyber Blue, the cyborg leader, Yellow Iris, a feline martial artist, Pink Ostrich, yes, a literal ostrich with a girl riding on its back, and Alien Green, a stretchy alien. Each one plays differently, with unique combos and special moves. The variety is insane compared to earlier beat-em-ups. Technically, it shines. The animations are smooth, the backgrounds are vibrant, and the combat is layered. You've got your standard attacks, but you also have upgrades, special techniques, and even tag team moves. It feels almost like a bridge between old-school beat-em-ups and modern action games. The downside? It never got a home release outside Japan until very recently, which meant a lot of players missed out. Also, the difficulty spikes hard near the end, with enemies that spam projectiles and bosses that take forever to kill. Oriental Legend, 1997. Now here's an underdog most players outside Asia never got to touch. Oriental Legend by IGS, a Taiwanese company that made a name for itself with arcade titles. The game is rooted in the Chinese classic novel Journey to the West, which instantly gives it an edge in personality. Playing as Sun Wukong, the Monkey King, Zhu Baji, Sha Wujing, or Tang Sanzang, you fight through a retelling of the legendary pilgrimage. What's impressive is how faithful it feels to the source material. The enemies aren't just generic thugs, you're battling demons, spirits, and mythological creatures pulled from Chinese folklore. The backgrounds reflect temples, rivers, and mountains straight out of classical art. For a 1997 arcade game, that cultural texture is impressive. Gameplay-wise, it's traditional beat-em-up fare, but with some neat twists. You've got magic attacks tied to your character, giving it a fantasy RPG edge. Bosses are challenging and creative, with screen-filling attacks and transformation sequences. And the visuals? Bright, colorful, almost cartoon-like in their charm. The catch is accessibility. If you didn't live in Asia, or have access to rare IGS machines, you probably never saw it. And while it's fun, it doesn't quite hit the mechanical polish of Capcom or Konami's big titles. Still, as a culturally rich and visually distinct beat-em-up, Oriental Legend deserves way more recognition. Golden Axe, 1989. This is the one that made me feel like a barbarian hero every time I dropped a coin in. Golden Axe from Sega is a fantasy beat-em-up that's part Conan the Barbarian, part Dungeons and Dragons, and 100% arcade magic. You pick one of three warriors: Axe Battler, sword-wielding barbarian, Tyrus Flare, sorceress with fire magic, or Gilius Thunderhead, badass dwarf with an axe. The mission? Defeat Death Adder, the evil tyrant who's kidnapped royalty and plunged the land into chaos. Classic setup, but boy does it deliver. The combat is simple but crunchy. You've got melee attacks, grabs, throws, and my favorite, the magic system. Collecting little elves' magic pots lets you unleash devastating screen-filling spells, from fire dragons to earthquakes. It felt revolutionary for 1989. And then there are the rideable beasts hopping on a fire-breathing dragon mid-battle. That never got old. On the downside, it's brutally short. You can finish the game in under 30 minutes if you're skilled. The difficulty spikes hard in the last stages, with enemy AI that reads your inputs, and the hit detection can sometimes feel inconsistent. Still, Golden Axe was pure arcade power fantasy. Vigilante, 1988. Vigilante, Irem's spiritual successor to Kung Fu Master, is a classic damsel in distress setup. Here, you play as a nameless street tough trying to rescue your girlfriend Madonna, yep, that's her actual name, from a gang called the Skinheads. The gameplay is simple but effective. You walk through side-scrolling stages, punching, kicking, and using nunchaku to take down waves of punks. Enemies swarm from both sides, and some carry weapons, which makes spacing crucial. Compared to earlier beat-em-ups, it adds more freedom of movement and more varied attacks. Graphically, it's solid for 1988. The music is catchy, if a bit repetitive, and the character sprites are clear enough to tell what's happening even when chaos erupts. The flaws? Like many early beat-em-ups, it gets repetitive fast. The enemy variety isn't great, and bosses are basically stronger versions of regular thugs. The difficulty ramps up in cheap ways, with enemies constantly ganging up on you. And let's be real, Madonna being kidnapped again and again feels like lazy writing. It's rough, but still worth a go. Renegade, Neketsu Koha Kunyo-kun, 1986. If there's one game that deserves more credit for shaping the beat-em-up genre, it's Renegade. Known as Neketsu Koha Kunyo-kun in Japan, it set the stage for Double Dragon and everything that came after. The premise is straightforward. You're a street fighter cleaning up gang-infested areas while rescuing your girlfriend. What makes it stand out is the shift from one-dimensional combat, like in Kung Fu Master, to full multi-directional movement. For the first time, you weren't just fighting left to right, you could move around an arena, dodging enemies and attacking from angles. Combat in Renegade feels gritty. You can punch, kick, and even grab enemies to throw them onto the ground or into hazards like subway tracks. Technically, it's a bit clunky now. The hit detection can be finicky, and the enemy AI is cheap, often swarming you relentlessly. The bad? It's short, repetitive, and frustratingly hard at times. But as a prototype for the entire genre, it's invaluable. Bad Dudes vs. Dragon Ninja, 1988. Data East's Bad Dudes is pure 80s cheese, and I kind of love it. The premise says it all. The president has been kidnapped by ninjas, and it's up to two street fighters, Blade and Striker, to rescue him. At the end, the president literally thanks you with burgers. It doesn't get more arcade than that. The gameplay is simple, side-scrolling brawling with a martial arts flavor. You've got punches, kicks, jump kicks, and the occasional weapon like knives or nunchaku. Enemies are almost entirely ninjas, which makes sense given the title, but it also means combat can feel repetitive. What I enjoy is the variety in environments. You fight on city streets, on top of trucks speeding down highways, in sewers, and even on a moving train. The flaws are pretty obvious, the controls are stiff, and the combat doesn't have the fluidity of later brawlers. Enemy waves feel cheap, and hit detection is inconsistent. And let's be honest, the dialogue, "Are you a bad enough dude to rescue the president?" is so corny it's hilarious. Double Dragon, 1987. Now we're talking. Double Dragon is one of the most influential beat-em-ups of all time. Developed by Technos, it took the foundation of Renegade and expanded it into something that felt like a full-on action movie. The story is simple. Marion, girlfriend of hero Billy Lee, gets kidnapped by a gang called the Black Warriors. Billy and his brother Jimmy punch and kick their way through city streets, factories, and forests to rescue her. Pretty basic, but the co-op gameplay is what made it legendary. For the first time, two players could team up, combining their attacks against waves of enemies. The combat was a huge step forward. You had punches, kicks, elbows, grabs, throws, and even weapons like whips and bats. It felt gritty, satisfying, and cinematic. Of course, it wasn't perfect. The slowdown was notorious, especially on home ports. The AI was cheap, bosses spammed unfair attacks, and sometimes enemies ganged up in ways that felt impossible to counter. And let's not forget the infamous ending, where if two players beat the game, Billy and Jimmy had to fight each other for Marion's love. Brutal. Double Dragon defined a genre. It inspired countless clones, sequels, and even a terrible live-action movie. Love it or hate it, its influence is undeniable. Ninja Baseball Batman, 1993. This one always gets a double take when I mention it. Released by Aram in 1993, it features 4 anthropomorphic baseball-themed ninjas battling through America to recover stolen golden artifacts. The heroes Captain Jose, Twin Bats Rhino, Beanball Roger, and Stickstraw each have different abilities, but all of them swing baseball bats as their primary weapon. The combat is surprisingly deep. You've got combos, aerial attacks, throws, and special moves that light up the screen. The animations are cartoonishly exaggerated, and the enemies are just as goofy. Technically, it's polished. The sprites are massive, colorful, and fluidly animated. The music is upbeat and catchy, and the stages from ballparks to amusement parks are full of charm. The downside? It was rare. Only a small number of arcade cabinets were ever made, mostly in Japan, so it never got the exposure it deserved. And while fun, it leans heavily into silliness, which might not click for everyone. For me though, Ninja Baseball Batman is a gem.
Top turf!
Tough Turf, 1989. Tough Turf is one of those forgotten beat-em-ups that never quite made it big but still deserves a mention. Developed by Sunsoft and Sega, it dropped in 1989 and plays very much like an early Double Dragon clone. The story is vague. 2 street fighters take on gangs across the city. No kidnapped girlfriend this time, just good old-fashioned brawling for dominance. You move through alleys, rooftops, construction sites, and parking lots, punching and kicking your way to the end. Gameplay-wise, it's straightforward. You've got punches, kicks, and jump attacks, plus the ability to pick up weapons like knives and pipes. The combat feels a little stiff compared to Capcom or Techno's games, but it does the job. The graphics are gritty, with a distinctly urban vibe, and the music is classic arcade rock. The enemy variety is minimal, though most thugs look and fight the same, and the difficulty ramps up unfairly, with enemies often swarming you faster than you can react. The biggest flaw? It didn't innovate. Still, if you like no-frills street brawlers with a bit of grit, it's worth checking out. Kung Fu Master, Spartan X, 1984. We've already touched on Kung Fu Master, but it's worth revisiting under its Japanese title, Spartan X. This was a milestone arcade game that set the foundation for the entire beat-em-up genre. Inspired by the Jackie Chan movie, Wheels on Meals, it cast you as Thomas, a martial artist climbing a 5-story pagoda to rescue his kidnapped girlfriend Sylvia. Each floor had its own challenges: knife throwers, snakes, dragons, and end bosses with unique patterns. The simplicity of the controls, just punch and kick, was offset by how intense the action felt. Enemies swarmed from both sides, forcing you to constantly react. The technical brilliance for 1984 was undeniable. The animation was smooth, the difficulty scaling was tight, and the sense of progression, floor by floor, felt cinematic. Of course, it feels limited today. The moveset is bare bones, enemy variety is small, and the sound effects are primitive. But in terms of influence, it's a giant. Without Spartan X, there's no Double Dragon, no Final Fight, and no beat 'em up. Boom. It deserves every ounce of respect. Marvelous verdict. After walking through this massive lineup of brutal, gory, and sometimes hilariously weird arcade beat-em-ups, one thing is clear: this genre was pure magic. From the early days of Kung Fu Master and Renegade laying the groundwork, to the big hitters like Double Dragon and Golden Axe, and finally, the experimental late entries like Battle Circuit and Ninja Baseball Batman, these games gave us raw energy, chaos, and a chance to feel unstoppable. Sure, some were clunky, repetitive, or outright bizarre, but that was part of the charm. They captured an era where arcades were loud, crowded, and every quarter meant adventure. For me, revisiting them isn't just nostalgia, it's a reminder of how bold, creative, and fun game design used to be. So, comment down below what other such lists you want to see, smash the like button, and subscribe to the channel if you enjoy our content. We'll see you next time. Goodbye!